So Matt Nagy was on Chris Collinsworth podcast this morning, I think. Well, the whole thing's buzzing on Twitter right now. We're buzzing because we're finally resuming YouTube after a week off because Max was on vacation. How was vacation? What's going on? How are you?
I'm doing great. Just, spent a nice week down in beautiful West Palm Beach in Miami, Florida, where a little other quarterback isn't doing too hot as compared to our boy, Tua. How do you feel about 5 picks in a single minicamp?
I mean, it's definitely weird, right? Especially for a guy going into year 2. And I think what makes this thing even more significant is just the fact that let's flash back to the 2019 season, man. What happened? Well, Tua Tagovailoa was considered to be the consensus QB1 going into the 2020 draft. And the hype wasn't even the fact that it was Tua. It was also, the hype was significantly there. Well, this goes all the way back to 2018, I should say. But the hype was there was because Alabama had produced an NFL caliber superstar at every single position but the quarterback position, and Tua was supposed to be the guy that was going to break that mold. And so now you look at, he had a pretty solid rookie season, had his ups, had his downs, all right, but then going into year 2, day 1 of mandatory minicamp, because NFL teams are kicking that off this week, you throw 5 interceptions. That is not what you want to hear for a guy going into year 2 that a lot of people were comparing to a left-handed Drew Brees or a left-handed Russell Wilson. And then just looking at some of these other quarterbacks around the league, look, man, I tweeted this out from our Fireside Bears Twitter account. And by the way, you can follow us on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, and TikTok at Fireside Bears. It's interesting, man. It's interesting because Zach Wilson had 2 interceptions today. Jets fans are in my mentions on Twitter right now saying like, oh, it's only one practice, but the guy went number 2 overall. Come on. And ahead of Justin Fields, when a lot of people thought Fields was the second best quarterback in this class. I mean, haven't heard. Mac Jones had a good day running with the scout team in New England. Trey Lance might start week 1, but Jimmy Garoppolo is apparently blowing the waters away. I'm not even going to discuss Trevor Lawrence because Trevor Lawrence is a surefire prospect that you hope the Jags don't ruin. And then you have Justin Fields, who's just been tearing it up this offseason, both on the field, man. I mean, the thing with Justin Fields is this. He's got really strong social media game. Love the hat game, by the way, Justin. Big shout out to you. And then he's just tearing it up at practice too, man.
Yeah, 100%. It's hard not to go on any sort of Chicago social media page without seeing Justin Fields somewhere. He's out at Cubs games. He's out in local establishments. He's really trying to get engrossed with the Chicago community. And remember, he said at his first time at Hallis Hall that he's only been to Chicago once before. So he's really trying to get involved with the community, involved with the fans. He knows this is his new home. And I think Chicago sports fans are always a class act in my book. And they've given him nothing but love and respect. His standing ovation at Wrigley Field was fantastic. And guess what? He was there with fellow rookies as well. Not just offensive rookies, but Travis Graham Jr. was there as well. So there's a lot to be happy about when regarding Justin Fields' on and off-field performance. And we really haven't seen that out of a quarterback in Chicago ever. Jay Cutler off the field was kind of non-existent. Mitch Trubisky was non-existent off the field. And really what you have to do to survive the Chicago media market as a quarterback is just be a likable guy. Be somebody that people can relate to, go out into the community, and he's doing that fantastic. So his agent's probably telling him all these things to do, and he's just listening, and he's doing a great job. And he was just with Cairo Santos and Pat O'Donnell, hanging out, hitting some golf balls with them the other day. How many rookie quarterbacks are hanging out with your special teamers, really trying to get engrossed with the team and the community? So fantastic class act, and he's been performing well at training camp. There was a report that he did have a little oopsie with 2 fumbled snaps. Is that really an area of concern, do you think?
I would say yes and no. And yes, it's an area of concern because you want a guy that I think had 63 touchdowns in college. You hope that that's very simple concept for him. But then again, it's just practice. I mean, these guys are going to have a lot of time to work things out. And I know I kind of tweeted this and said, oh yeah, well, Zach Wilson's struggling. Look, these guys struggling is significant, but it's also not that significant. People have to understand because there's still a long way to go. I mean, what you do in June doesn't matter. What you do in July really matters. But it's still some really interesting stuff worth monitoring. And you know what? What's interesting about Fields at Ohio State is that you could kind of say this, that could kind of expect him to struggle with a lot of the under center exchanges, because if you look at that Ohio State offense, man, they ran shotgun a lot of the time, it seemed like. So naturally he's going to struggle with that. And it's not even the fact that Fields is struggling with the snaps under center. It just seems like every single year rookie quarterbacks have that issue with snapping the ball from under center or in the early parts of the offseason. And then they do it so much to the point where by the time training camp rolls around, those guys are ready to go. So yes, it's a concern, but it's not really a concern, but it's still something worth monitoring, because again, it is Justin Fields, a guy that could significantly alter the course of the Bears franchise, but also NFL history.
Yeah, and for those who don't know, center and quarterback relations vary from center to quarterback. So it's not just an easy transition into a new center. It takes time. Not every snap is going to be in the same place every time. Some guys like it a little higher, some guys like it a little lower. So this is something that usually gets worked out in mini camps and in off-season practices, and it could continue even into the season. But like you said, I'm not really that concerned. I'd rather him fumble a snap here and there in mini camp than throw 5 picks in a single practice. But moving onto this season, Matt Nagy had an interesting conversation with Chris Collinsworth on his podcast over at PFF. And, I got to say, first of all, Matt Nagy has been on a media circus, man. I tweeted this out earlier. I think the NFL knows Justin Fields is something to be watching, one of the top prospects, absolute media icon and personality that they think he's going to develop into. So they've been throwing Matt Nagy around. Chicago's a huge media market. Bears are a big media team. So why not have the head coach of the Bears go on basically every professional football big media platform and talk about how much he likes Justin Fields, or just talk about Justin Fields? So here we are, after talking to Chris Collinsworth, who's always been high and has always had nice things to say about Matt Nagy and Justin Fields. We had some interesting update that Matt Nagy didn't commit to having Andy Dalton 100% starter day one. He did say that he thinks that that's where it's heading, but he also said, quote, "I can't predict anything. You know how it goes. There's so many things that could happen between today and week 1, but Andy is our starter and Justin is our number 2. So that doesn't sound like 100% commitment to week 1, Andy Dalton, but it also doesn't sound like 100% commitment week 1 to Justin Fields. Sounds like we have a quarterback controversy brewing here in Chicago.
Well, yeah, I want to flash back to you talking about big media markets and Justin Fields first before I analyze this quote. But hey, listen, Justin Fields' sister Jaden plays softball at the University of Georgia, and she was on 670 The Score, I think, last week on Thursday or Friday. And I tweeted, I was just like, oh yeah, Chicago's so fired up for Justin Fields that even freaking sports radio is bringing on the sister of the star quarterback. And then Bernstein and Layla Rahimi, they came at me on Twitter, the national radio host, and they were like, well, Jaden's a star in her own right. She deserves her own recognition. But if you listen to that interview, because I know it's available online, most of the questions were about Jaden and Justin being so competitive growing up. But ultimately, you look at this man, listen. The key thing that sticks out to me about this quote is there's so many things that can happen between today and week 1. That means there's so much that can happen between Tuesday, June 15th and September 12th, which is, I believe, the week 1 opening game, or the 13th, right around that time. But it's key because that's Matt Nagy essentially saying, hey, listen, I'm going to take a step back from what I said and hold a double stand and have a double standard here, essentially, because the Bears have said 4 times this offseason Andy Dalton's a starter. Andy Dalton said it twice this offseason, I'm the starter, at his introductory press conference with the Chicago media back in March, as well as when he talked to reporters, I think in phase 1 or phase 2 of OTAs. And all of a sudden, anytime you get the head coach dropping a little tidbit of there's so much that can change, yeah, there is so much that can change. So Matt Nagy's not afraid to do a full 180. And I think, forget Chris Collinsworth for a second here. If you look at some of these other national media members that are people in the national media that know Matt Nagy really well, one guy that sticks out, and he's openly shown his love for the Bears on social media, is Louis Riddick. And Louis is open. Louis said the night of the draft that the Bears traded up that this pick was going to have Matt Nagy's fingerprints all over it. And so I think that if we get a report either or something from a guy like Louis Riddick regarding what Matt Nagy said, there's a lot of weight that's held to it. Because one thing I can tell you guys listening to this right now or watching this is that Matt Nagy's very close with Louis Riddick. So ultimately, when you look at something like this, Nagy's dropping a tidbit like that, he's basically saying, hey, listen, I'm not going to leave the door closed for my very own handpicked quarterback to start. And I think that this is significant also, Max, before I let you go here, last point for me. It's because, what was it, like 2 or 3 weeks ago, Jeremy Fowler of ESPN was on one of the ESPN talk shows and was like, look, in Chicago, they're not going to sit Justin Fields just for the sake of sitting Justin Fields. If you thought that report was BS, I'm here to tell you that report's 110% true. And this report just feeds into what Fowler reported a couple weeks ago.
Absolutely. And, you know, these questions were going to arise anyways with a high-profile first-round draft pick quarterback like Justin Fields, whether or not he should start week 1. But there have been some disappointments from Andy Dalton in the first couple of days of mini camps and OTAs as well, with him throwing a couple interceptions against backups. Now, that could be him getting used to the scheme, but like we've said here on the episode or the podcast before, and as we'll continue to say, Andy Dalton's incredibly familiar with Bill Lazor's offense. So for him to be throwing interceptions against, you know, scout teams, backups, and rookies, you got to start scratching your head. You got to start asking some questions. Maybe he's kicking some of the rust off, but remember, he did start a good amount of games last year for the Cowboys. There's some areas of concern there, and I think that that's something valid that fans are expressing, that if it comes down to it, if Justin Fields, early September, is just performing better in practice than Andy Dalton, what's the reason to not start him? Now, my quick answer before I let you jump into that is, well, I don't want him to get absolutely destroyed week 1 on national television against Aaron Donald and the Los Angeles Rams and then ruin a guy's, charisma or swagger that he's carrying onto the field. He's feeling all this momentum and then thud into a brick wall. Now, that's what I don't want to happen. But what do you think?
Yeah, I would say that's definitely a valid cause for concern right there, because again, when people also have to understand, listen, when the Bears are saying we want to start Andy Dalton and we're going to let Justin Fields be the number 2 guy, they're saying that because this is an organization that for 102 years has done nothing the right way in terms of the quarterback position, besides take swings, but those swings ultimately end up being misses a couple of years later. So when the Bears say they want to start Andy Dalton, they're trying to do something the right way. So don't get mad if they're going to start Andy Dalton, if they continue to double down and say we're going to start Andy Dalton. But at the same time, let's be honest. I mean, Fields struggled against Northwestern and Indiana in a shortened season in 2020. And then in the college football playoff, I understand the hype was on Alabama and Trevor Lawrence, but you know what? You can't tell me that this past season Justin Fields wasn't the best quarterback in the college, the best player overall in the college football playoff. Overall, when you look at it, I mean, yeah, he had those bad games against Northwestern Indiana. So if he goes out week 1 and Fields has a bad game, I'm not going to be overly concerned because he's shown that he can bounce back from rough moments. And he did it time and time again in Ohio State. I mean, it was one of the reasons that he returned to Columbus for his 2020 season anyway, because his main goal was to beat Clemson. And you know what? That 2019 college football playoff, I mean, yeah, Fields had the 1 interception against Clemson that kind of sealed Ohio State's fate. But then the very next year, man, I mean, he picked up right where he left off despite having a shortened season. So if they trot him out there week 1, the Bears get absolutely destroyed, and Justin Fields kind of gets destroyed, I'm not going to be concerned because you know he's got the mindset to bounce back no matter what the case is.
Yeah, and if you watch that Indiana film, which I did with Anthony Rivardo over at Fireside Giants and Empire Sports Media, if you're a Giants fan, check them out. We're releasing a breakdown here pretty soon. The one thing that you noticed about Justin Fields in that game, where he made some really bad decisions, what led to some really ugly interceptions, was he wouldn't go out that next drive and look to check down. He was still going for the home run balls after he threw an interception. And in the post-game conference, he told you exactly why that interception happened. Now, here's the thing that's really interesting about the Indiana defense, for those who point to that game as, oh, he's not NFL ready, is Indiana runs such an interesting defensive scheme. The way that they hide things is very Vic Fangio-esque for Bears fans or anybody who likes defenses. That is a very interesting defensive scheme that not a whole lot of defenses in the NFL run. And if you really look at Ohio State's line, they were getting tossed around by Indiana's front four. So if the Chicago Bears have a solid line to protect Justin Fields this year, more time in that pocket allows him to make some of these more reads. He's not a one-read quarterback. If you look at any game film, you'll understand that he looks for his progressions. But he's also, if he sees his first reads wide open down the field, he's not afraid to take that, which I absolutely love about him. And like PFF said, he's the most accurate college quarterback they've ever recorded. So if there's anyone out there that's worrying about his accuracy or worrying about his reads, you're just not looking at the stats. But anyways, a lot of good things to look at. And of course, we'll be bringing you the news as it comes up and as it arises and giving our nice little spin on it about Justin Fields. But we also have some news about the tight end locker room. What are we hearing about that?
There's a lot that's going on because Cole Kmet spoke to the media last week. I believe it was like Wednesday or Thursday he spoke, and he kind of talks about, oh, hey, look, I'm looking to take the next step going into year 2. And I know we've touched on Cole Kmet briefly here at Fireside Bears. I've done tons of research on him over at the Bear Report as well, the other podcast and website that I do work for. And one of the interesting things was that for Cole Kmet, his rookie season was still 2 halves because that first half of the year, he really wasn't used. The second half of the year, here he is playing like 85 or 86% of snaps, somewhere around that early to mid 80% ballpark number. Now, going into year 2, I think the Bears are hoping that he becomes a more complete tight end. And what does that mean? Last year, he was used as a blocker. He was used in the short yardage passing game on that play action offense that Matt Nagy was running specifically to cover up Mitch Trubisky's strengths. But this year, what you want to be able to do is this with Cole Kmet. You want to move him around. So he's going to line up on the line of scrimmage and he is going to be a blocker, but he's also going to line up on the line of scrimmage as a receiver. You want to be able to shift him out there into the slot, match him up against smaller defensive backs and linebackers. So you're scheming him up and setting him up in such a situation where he's going to develop into a mismatch weapon. Now, does Kmet have breakaway speed? No. But does he have what it takes to be that big-bodied bully, similar to a guy like a Zach Ertz, for example? 110%. And I know some people are like, well, Cole Kmet's ceiling is Kyle Rudolph. No, if you look at Cole Kmet last year, everything he showcased showed that he could be a Zach Ertz or a Dallas Goedert light instead of being closer to a guy like a Kyle Rudolph. And then Jimmy Graham said he contemplated retirement this offseason, but wanted to come back because Ryan Pace and Matt Nagy convinced him to. Look, when you look at Jimmy Graham at this point, you have to understand is unless the Bears are going to be a heavy 12 personnel team in 2021, you should see a lot more 11 personnel looks, and that means Kmet should be your tight end 1 out there. And then Jimmy Graham's going to come in when you do run some of those 12 or 13 personnel looks in the red zone. But Jimmy Graham, if you run 12 personnel, should only be in the game as a red zone target.
Yeah, absolutely. Nagy, over the past 2 years, primarily runs 11 personnel. Bill Lazor didn't change under his direction as well. And what we really saw, like you said, was Jimmy Graham taking up that. He's more of a flex tight end, so he's not necessarily going to line up on the line all the time. But that's always been Jimmy Graham's specialty. That's who he is. He is a flex. He stretches the field. He has that freakish athleticism. Not so much anymore, but he definitely used to. So when we're looking into the future, which I think is really interesting, was why did we see Cole Kmet break out towards the later half of the season? And I think it's because he had that mentoring aspect with Jimmy Graham, who is one of the best flex tight ends in the past 10, 12 years in the NFL. So for him to be able to give Cole Kmet pointers on, hey, line up, here are some tips and tricks to get around backers or nickel backs, whoever you're running up against, we saw him in the passing game more. Now, Cole Kmet originally was a wide tight end, which means he's on the line, he's a big body, he's blocking a lot, and he's going to be there for the short routes like you mentioned, or some of the safety valves on a bootleg, so he's just right there to pick it up, which he got a lot of those. What really excites me about Cole Kmet is he loves contact. He loves running over the guy in front of him. If you watch any of his film, you'll see he's never afraid. He's not going to run out of bounds without hitting somebody first. That is what gets me excited about a big body tight end down the field. Because once you play with that physicality, once you play with that intimidation factor, you're going to have backers and you're going to have defensive backs who are maybe a little afraid to jump up there and get their nose in the pile because you know you're going to get run over by the beast of a man that Cole Kmet is. So absolutely excited to see him play in more of this flex position. He's kind of like a Swiss Army knife at this point. He's going to be able to play wherever you put him. He's fast. He doesn't have that breakaway speed, but he has a good amount of quickness. He has that strength that you love to see. His blocking, honestly, isn't all that to write home about, but his ability to secure the catch in contested areas is fantastic, and I'm really excited to see where he develops. But because we're not taking him, or we're not seeing him as much as that solid Y inline tight end option, the Bears brought in Jake Butt, an interesting tryout, should we say, for a former high-profile, high-valued Michigan tight end that's had some injury concerns over the past couple of years. So why did the Bears bring him in?
Well, it's obviously for depth. Look, the Bears released tight end Darian Clark on Sunday night, who was a player that had a basketball background. So let me just break Darian Clark down first. The reason the Bears brought Darian Clark in is because Ryan Pace was in New Orleans back in 2010 when they drafted another tight end by the name of Jimmy Graham that had a basketball background. So you always know that Ryan Pace values these tight ends that have had basketball backgrounds. I mean, hell, even Adam Shaheen went to Ashland Community College and had a basketball background before he fully switched over to the football program. So ultimately, the Bears just have this affinity, you want to say, for tight ends that have a basketball background. And when you ultimately look at it, you're realizing you're going into the year, man. I mean, you have Kmet and Jimmy Graham. Okay, that's two guys that are guaranteed roster spots. But then you have J.P. Holtz, who's been here for the last couple of years. You have Jesper Horsted and Scooter Harrington, an undrafted free agent. And Horsted split time between the 53-man roster as well as the practice squad over the last couple of years. But you're bringing in Jake Butt just because you know that if one of Kmet or Graham goes down, which, by the way, knock on wood, hoping that doesn't happen, if one of those guys goes down, you're in a situation where your depth at tight end takes a significant hit because J.P. Holtz is a guy that, again, is more of a blocking tight end. And then you don't really know what you have in Scooter Harrington. And I mean, he's just there because you need another guy to create competition for guys like J.P. Holtz as well as Jesper Horsted. And then I know some people in the Bears fan base, like our guy Sam Stevenson, they've got this love for Jesper Horsted. Look, man, Horsted's only the one career moment, 2019 Thanksgiving, where he made the game-winning touchdown against the Lions. But ultimately, he's going into like year 3 or 4. And if he was as good as some people make him out to be, then there would be no reason to bring in Jake Butt. But ultimately, you're just bringing in Jake Butt, man, because you know what? You need to create some additional competition. You're not even signing him. You're just bringing him in to see how he looks and is he going to be legitimate competition for your tight ends 3, 4, and 5.
Yeah, Jake Butt has had really, really bad ACL problems over the past 3 years, missing 2 seasons because of ACL injuries. And then last season, played 1 game because of a hamstring injury that knocked him out. So he is riddled with injuries, but if he's able to compete and perform, he is a solid blocking inline tight end option. I'm big on Scooter. I like Scooter a lot. I don't know what it is. I guess Bears fans just really like obscure players that don't really get a lot of play time. Scooter lit it up at Stanford. He was a pretty high profile draft pick a while back, and there was a lot of scouts that were pretty high on him. Had some injury issues as well. But what I like about Scooter is that he's kind of what Cole Kmet could have been. He has great hands. He's pretty athletic. He's really strong. But again, if he can't really compete to that NFL level, remember, just because somebody did well in college doesn't mean they're going to do well in the NFL. We might have some difficulties in the tight end room, which again blows my mind. Because remember, literally a year ago today, we were the laughingstock of the NFL because we had about 10 to 11 tight ends in the tight end room at a given time. And the joke was running around that we could just have our own NFL team full of tight ends and that Ryan Pace loves his tight ends. Well, we only have about 5 on the roster now, and only 1 or 2 of them are considered in the top 50% of tight ends in the NFL. So if there's an area of concern that the Bears should focus on in this next draft or in the next free agency, it's definitely bringing in talent at the tight end position, because we know Cole Kmet's not going anywhere, but Jimmy Graham's probably his last year. And like you said, Ryan Pace and Matt Nagy talked to Jimmy about staying. And what I think is really interesting is Graham told reporters that reason he stayed is because, quote, he doesn't like to lose, and that he left like there's something on the table. So for me, and Allen Robinson's back into the fray, which is fantastic. Like you mentioned a couple episodes ago, I think some of the players are noticing a culture shift. I think Nagy is doing a fantastic job, and I think that they're excited. I think they can win this year, which A lot of analysts don't think that they can, but if the players buy into the message, they're buying into the hype with Justin Fields at QB1, with some of the fantastic draft picks, with some solid free agency, signings. Some of these players that we didn't think were going to come back are back, and they're excited to play. Jimmy Graham and Allen Robinson were taking photos together for the media photo shoot, which also looks super cool. I want one of those cubes, those little TV cubes. But moving on from that, I think there's a lot to be excited about. Again, every week brings something new. We're about a month and 2 months away from the regular season starting, but there's always something to talk about. So if you've liked what you saw, if you like what you hear, and if you want to hear more, make sure you leave a follow on any of our social medias and subscribe to our YouTube channel here. We post about 3 times a week, maybe more. Depends on how we're feeling, depends on how the news cycle's going. But when the season starts, we'll be posting just about every day if we can. So thank you guys. Remember to bear down, follow us on Twitter, and have a great day.